I've been in law enforcement for 16 years here in Texas, and have seen my fair share of tragic, creepy, and downright unexplainable things on the job. From murder scenes to suicide calls to fatality accidents. Sometimes a place just feels, well, different though. I've shared before about a death notification call that I responded to, but this is another encounter that still sticks with me. So, my partner and I were dispatched to a burglary in process at a local residence. The homeowner, visibly shaken, met us outside in the front yard crying. She said that she believed somebody was inside upstairs. So we cleared the first floor and we made our way up. As we moved room to room, we suddenly heard a sort of shuffling noise, like someone sliding across the wooden floor. It seemed to be coming from the bathroom at the end of the hallway. The door was locked, the lights were off. When we called out, we heard a woman softly crying inside. We told her that we were the police and she responded, "I'm scared," followed by something like, "Someone is here." To reassure her, my partner put his badge on the ground and lit it up with a flashlight. A moment later, we heard the click of the lock. We opened the door pretty quickly and the bathroom was completely empty. We checked every possible exit, and I mean every single possible exit, but there was nothing. Nobody. The house was cleared and there was nothing. Back at the PD, my partner ran a history check, and the last call at that address, it was nearly a year ago to the day. A woman had passed away there on hospice. The current owner that we had met outside, that was her daughter. This experience and many others prompted me to start sharing stories like this from the job. If you're interested, I would love to share more stories with all of you guys. I would also like to hear from all of you guys if you've ever had an experience something like this, an unsettling history in your haunted town or something, or if you've ever experienced something that you just cannot explain. If you have any stories like this, then please do share them in the comments below because I would love to read them. A few months ago, I was driving home really late, around 3 a.m. or so. I was on a 28-ish mile road on my way back to the city, so I'm driving in a pretty rural area. I'm about 5 miles out, so the city is coming into the distant view, when I noticed that there was a car stopped in the lane. So I turned to the left and pulled up alongside of them. Their headlights were on, and there was also a body in the road. What seemed like a woman was on the road, completely crumbled, as if she had no bones or anything to give her shape. I've never seen a human being like that before, and she laid there like a pile of unfolded laundry. That's the closest way that I could describe it. She was just a heap. I cannot even begin to express how contorted her body was, though. Nothing was where it should have been, really, and she was fully illuminated by the headlights, so I know that I wasn't seeing a trick of the light or anything. A couple, I presume a husband and a wife, were both at the car. The husband was standing outside looking at the woman, and the wife seemed to be on the phone with 911. I was shocked and didn't know what to do, but the wife told me, "You can go." She didn't seem panicked at all. In fact, she seemed surprised that I had even bothered to stop. But I listened to her and eventually I left. I kept driving, and after a few miles I drove by EMS who was heading there. I still don't know what that was, to be honest. I mean, their car wasn't dented, so it didn't suggest a hit and run or anything. Also, weirdly, there was zero blood too. And I mean, even if they did hit her, she was at least 5 miles away from the city, and there's no sidewalks or anything out there. I don't understand how she even got there, to be honest, and I certainly don't understand how her body made that shape. I kept my eyes on the news, but it was never reported about publicly, it seemed. I thought perhaps that maybe it was a trafficking thing or something, like she'd been dumped on the road, but nothing was ever posted about it. And really, I just don't know what to make of it. I keep trying to think of a logical conclusion, but none of it seems to add up. I mean, sure, she could have been on drugs and walked all the way out there, but that doesn't explain her body. The car could have hit her, but it was in pristine shape, as though it was fresh from the dealership. Also, being hit by a car doesn't do that to your body. I cannot clear this from my mind, and any input would be genuinely appreciated. My father and uncle have a story of living as outsiders, non-native or Caucasian, young people on the reservation. Their tale is an experience of a skinwalker. Now, my grandma taught school on the reservation, and they lived well off compared to the natives living there. From what I know, there's a lot of laws surrounding the Navajo Nation, non-natives, primarily older generations, keeping their experiences and stories left unspoken, especially to those not from the culture. Forgive me if I'm mistaken in any of this too, the culture, the ideology, practices, or any other part. I'm just trying to tell my story that my family has only spoken to me in whispers about. My grandmother, father, and uncle, they lived there for a few years, and their experiences was much different than the Navajo people, who have lived there for generations upon generations. But I just want to tell their story and get insights as to anyone else who has lived in the community and any other stories some people might be willing to share. So, my father and uncle are about 2 years apart in age. They lived in Navajo Mountain in the 1980s. My dad was 10 to 12 and my uncle younger. As it goes, they were always outside riding bikes with their friends, natives of the reservation. My grandma was recovering from an abusive relationship with their father and wasn't too concerned with their whereabouts most of the time, being that it was a small community. There wasn't much trouble around, nor would they know what real trouble was at that age, to be honest. Trouble wasn't the issue to young white boys on a reservation then. Pure terror was. It was a typical night without any parental supervision. The night was colder than usual, and the night sky was blacker than you could imagine. In such a desolate place, the stars in the sky would light the night. This night was as if the earth had moved to a different dimension, an abyss almost. The boys, they raced each other as they did every night, until they were compelled to force their brakes in unison. They simultaneously looked up. Each boy's face melted from carefree, innocent, and adolescent to unadulterated horror. The boys stood motionless, grasping their bikes with every nerve, muscle, and strength in their body on the dirt road. To the right of them was a mesa, one that they rode by every day almost. The mesa that actually paralleled my family's home. The mesa that they could see through my father and uncle's bedroom every night. This mesa would become fear and nightmares to them from this night forward. At the top of the mesa was a roaring fire, taller than any bonfire that someone could assemble, bigger than a group of people could assemble. It raged and was unbelievable to them. It was almost as tall as the mesa itself, in fact. More unbelievable, though, was the pitch-black figure seen cavorting around the bonfire. The native boys with my father and uncle informed them that this was not a typical Navajo dance or ritual. Pits began to form in their stomachs. Friends of my father and uncle, they turned back around without a word and bolted back to their homes. My father and uncle, they threw their bikes to the ground and ran across the unpaved road into their home. The two came back in a panic, relaying what they had seen to my grandmother, but she was pretty much unconcerned. A legend of the natives, she told them, and shooed them away. They laid awake all night in their shared room, not saying a word to one another. They forced their curtains as close as possible, too scared to look out the window and see what they shouldn't have to begin with. Neither could shake the images burnt into their memory, but the sun managed to rise and peek through into their room eventually. A sense of relief washed over them as the darkness had faded. The boys left their beds and traveled to the kitchen to try a second time to tell my grandmother what they saw that night. They tried to get a handle on what it was, but it was as if they just couldn't explain it. Again, too, my grandmother brushed them off. With a coffee and a newspaper more important than their story, she told them to climb the mesa and to investigate for themselves. The boys wrangled the friends who shared the experience with them the night prior as they passed on their bikes. The friends stayed on the dirt road, looking up at the mesa as my father and uncle climbed up to see any evidence of a hell-burning fire that they witnessed together. The mesa wasn't much taller than an average one-story house, so the brothers took less than 2 minutes to climb to the top where the nightmare took place. When they got to the top, they were hysterical and also relieved. There was no indication of a bonfire of that enormity, or even a fire at all had taken place on the mesa that they had clearly seen the night prior. They climbed down and took the message to the friends who had also been a part of the shocking scene. Their native friends looked at them in shock, but neither said a word to them. They immediately turned their bikes around and proceeded to go home. It was never talked about again, despite my father and brother asking about it. My grandmother and everyone else in the community refused to talk about it again, too. My father is a skeptic. He doesn't believe in anything paranormal, aliens, ghosts, mermaids, you name it. But whenever I ask about the skinwalker that he saw, he always turns pale and white. He gets quiet, jumpy and curt. I had to plead to get the full story out of him, in fact, and I could see goosebumps and every hair standing on his arms when he shared his experience. My grandma, she took me to Navajo Mountain in 2019 to show me her history and to see how Navajo natives still live on this reservation today. According to her, not much has changed since living there in the 80s too. I hiked and explored what I could of the reservation, avoiding the parts that I wasn't allowed in, so as not to invade or violate any of the Navajo reservation and its beauty. However, I did feel a change in mood when I visited, I guess. My existence felt heavy, as if I wasn't supposed to be there, or as if I was invading on territory that wasn't meant for me. Not caused by any of the community there, but just seemingly by my presence being on that land. I will never forget my experience visiting and all that I learned about the reservation life. I climbed the mesa where the skinwalker my dad and uncle had its ritual, and I felt pretty normal until I got to the top and stood in the middle. It was then that I could have sworn that I felt some sort of a darkness creep into me as I stood there. I've never been the same since then, and I certainly won't be going back. One day I was hiking in the woods to a favorite spot of mine. It's off the main trail and pretty hidden to the general public. I was by myself and hanging out on this elevated little bluff overlooking the ocean. I had eaten some lunch that I had packed, and I was just sort of sitting there with my back to the woods, lost in my thoughts, and enjoying the peaceful scenery as I had done many times before. Then something extremely weird or even scary happened. As I was sitting there, kind of zoning out, my visual perspective suddenly shifted to about 5 to 10 feet behind me, and I could see myself. This perspective began moving towards me from behind until it came right up to me, and then my perspective shifted again to seeing myself from the front. From the front, I could see myself, and there was this creature practically on top of me, behind me, It had its face next to mine over my shoulder and was placing its hands over my mouth and eyes. It had its right hand over my mouth and left hand over my eyes. Its hands or fingers were gangly and long and easily covered the span of my head or face. It had a wide mouth and appeared to be grinning, and I felt, instantly, a malevolence coming from it. I remember one of my immediate thoughts was that it vaguely resembled Groot from the MCU, but more evil, if that makes sense. This sequence of images seemed to occur in the space of a second, and upon seeing this thing trying to grab me, I freaked out and at the same time mentally denied it, like, no, this isn't real. I jumped up and turned around to see that there was nothing there. I was extremely freaked out, but I forced myself to calmly pack up my gear and my belongings. Now, as I was packing, I noticed the silence. Not only was it completely quiet, but I swear that I could feel something watching me from the woods with something like intense hatred. This feeling of intensity and anger or hatred was almost tangible, in fact. The whole walk back to the main trail, I had a sense of certainty that I was going to encounter something that wouldn't let me make it back. I remember the first bird that I heard again was a crow, and I just felt greatly relieved upon hearing it, and then even more so once I returned to the main trail. I'm not really sure what to make of this experience, but for me the scariest was this realization that I had. I somehow knew that if in that moment I had believed that this creature was real, then I would have lost myself, like it was trying to bait me into an alternate reality or something. At the time that this happened, over a year ago now, I had been using the gateway tapes. I went into them very skeptical, but looking for a shortcut to deep meditation, I guess you could say. I found success quickly and began having spiritual experiences. However, I do think that I may have somehow exposed myself or become vulnerable in some way to whatever the heck that was. So I'm a real estate photographer, and I've been visiting about 2 houses a day for the past 3 years, working for various agencies in a big city in Spain. To set some context too, most of the homes in this city are just flats, with a very small minority of bigger homes. And normally, real estate agents just hand me the keys and they don't visit the property with me. Now, I was in a flat on one of the city's main streets, previously being warned about the alarm system on it, which was quite difficult to turn off apparently, and had gone off on the agent which had previously visited the home, which turned into police visiting them suddenly too. And well, off I went to a great start. I was still inexperienced in this job at the time, and hadn't faced any alarm systems, so, as expected, it went off on me. I was able to set it off and begin working, thankfully. A normal flat in a nice part of town, old but with great windows that made it really bright. Nothing to be afraid of. Well, on the living room, the room closest to the other flat on this floor, I got quite a surprise. You see, the eye tracking feature on my camera, which I had forgotten to turn off after a portrait session, was detecting a face, which it tracked through the living room, steady from one wall to the opposite and back. It was still a new camera to me, so I guessed a software bug and I just kept on working. Not long after that though, while I'm packing up after finishing, I got a ring on the intercom of this flat's door, and unsurprisingly, it's the police. I had long forgotten about the alarm, and having finished the shoot, I was about to head downstairs to the building's entrance. A really kind officer told me through the intercom that he just wanted to talk to this flat's owner, to which I answered that I was just the photographer who had set off the alarm and I was coming down to meet them, hoping to reassure them that it was nothing and I would be on my way. Now, at the building's door were 4 officers, 2 of which who were trying to calm a really nervous old lady. I haven't heard from him in a few days. I thought that he was just angry and didn't want to talk to me, but I was worried and asked his friends if they had heard from him, and they haven't. Please, just check his flat. I was pulled apart and told that I had nothing to worry about, the alarm going off and all that. However, they wanted to ask me if during my stay there that I had heard any signs of life or anything, or met the old gentleman who apparently lived next door to that flat that I had just photographed. Now, this is when the memory of the eye tracking comes to me. However, I'm a pretty logical guy, I like to think, and I tell them that I haven't. They thank me for my time, and before I know it, I'm on my way, tight on time to get to the next job. All the while, they're now telling the lady that they're going to force the door as they haven't been able to reach whoever was inside through knocking, ringing the intercom, or anything else. I didn't get any more news on the situation as obviously I had to leave relatively quickly. But later, I asked the agent in charge if they had heard anything, and he had apparently. The poor man had passed away of what they assumed was a sudden stroke about a couple of days before I did the photo shoot. And now I'm really not so sure about that software bug, as it hasn't happened again in the 3 years that I've owned that camera. And I can assure you that there were no patterns similar to faces in that living room after checking the photos and everything. Who knows? Maybe it was the gentleman's way of trying to tell someone he was no longer with us, as he seemed to not be too missed in the outside world. This has made me long reflect, though, about the loneliness that some older people experience in my area. But that's a whole nother story. Now, the next story was an old flat in the city centre. An old painter with a bit of a hoarding problem had passed recently. Their family wanted to sell that flat, and I was scheduled to enter before the agent arrived and start my work. The house had now been emptied, with only a couple of closets remaining, still unemptied. One with a single suite kept opening, but that was surely just a dodgy door, nothing else. But the real scare came about halfway through my work, when the flat's doorbell rang. Not the apartment store, but the building's. Now, there was no ring camera, so I asked for identification, and upon hearing nothing in return, I assumed that the interphone was broken, and I guessed that it was the agent, so I just opened. I left the flat doors open for my client to come in, and I heard the elevator come to my floor. I should state here too that there was only one flat on this floor, which took over the entirety of it really. But I clearly heard the elevator come up and stop at my floor, so I went to greet the agent, which was also a bit of a close friend. The elevator had a door that you had to manually push out from inside it to get out, and I waited next to it for the agent to get out, but it wasn't opening. So I guess he was distracted on his phone inside. I waited a little bit longer, and finally the doors open. I say hello, without any answer. The door was obstructing my view of the inside of the area, though, where someone would have come out. And when it closed, that was when I realized that there was no one there. I reopened the elevator to check if he had forgotten something inside, but no one was there either. I was really creeped out by that, as the flat already gave me some bad feelings, so I returned inside, and as a childish way to protect myself, I bolted the door with my set of keys. Half an hour later, the agent arrives, and this time the phone was working perfectly when I went to answer the doorbell. I told him the story, and we left soon afterward, but he kept telling me over the next month how he also felt unwelcome in the flat every time that he went there for a showing. He had some problems with a particular door slamming shut without any wind currents inside the home on the last showings, apparently, and he ended up never managing to sell this flat, and so eventually the sale was passed on to another agent. Now, my next experience wasn't so much frightening, but sort of emotionally heavy, I guess. You see, I arrived once again alone to a flat that was to be put up for sale, with a real estate agent not having visited it previously. I still could not wrap my head around how he decided to contract photography services or even go ahead with a sale without even checking the home first, but, well, that's on him. If I get paid, I do the job. Well, when I opened the door, the typical childhood grandma's house smell greeted me, which initially usually feels just a bit nostalgic, I guess. It's a normal day-to-day part of my job, so that itself isn't that upsetting to me. I usually do a quick check around the home to decide where to begin and if anything is to be moved, and most of this house was honestly pretty spotless, despite some cooking utensils and ingredients in the kitchen table, which is normal for a property that hasn't been previously emptied. However, as I progressed through, I slowly felt sadder and a bit more choked up sort of thing, like irrationally sad for a home, or a previous inhabitant or something, for whom I have no connection to. Well, when I got to the main room, I was met with an orthopedic bed, still in the last position that its user left it in, so slightly raised and stuff. But what stood out the most to me was a chair next to it, with some older woman's clothes, a single outfit perfectly laid out as if someone was to grab it the next morning when they wake up and went about their lives, but was forever untouched as that plan suddenly got interrupted by something. Feeling close to tears, which I'm normally not an emotional guy, I finished up as quickly as I could and I left. I decided not to inquire further about the previous inhabitants. I would like to think that they just went to a hospice home and forgot about the outfit there or something and are happy anywhere else, but the house's energy just really didn't feel like it. Anyway, now, I don't usually get homes with multiple floors, but this next one was my first ever. It was my first week doing this job on a contract with an agency, and still not freelancing as I do today. I was pretty hyped up for my first big house, but upon arrival it all went away pretty quickly. Once again, I was there by myself, with the agent ready to hop on a call if I needed anything. I opened the main door and left the keys on the lock, just obviously on the inside, so that I didn't forget them when I left the home. Once I started looking around, everything was sort of frozen in time, with a newspaper dating back to 2019. It was 2021 at this point. It was on the sofa, and there was an older magazine with numbers and so on there as well. When this happens, it usually is, at least to me, tied to a "you should not be here" sort of feeling. However, when I went onto the second floor to visit the rooms, what stood out the most to me was a huge Anarchy A graffiti drawn on the main room's closet in silver spray in quite a big size. I called the agent to inquire about it, checking if there had been vandalism or anything. Turns out that the home was being sold for investors, and the whole story was actually quite sad. A mother had lost her husband and single kid in a car accident, had slowly fallen into depression, dabbled with drugs, and tragically ended up self-deleting, although not inside of this home. Well, with this newfound information, everything began to feel quite a little bit more eerie. I still went on with my job, although I must admit that I was rather irrationally afraid of the basement. But I finally got to the last area, a garage filled with some toy boxes, skis, and other normal stuff, attached to the house through a metal door in the main corridor. This door was heavy, man, and it took quite some force to open it. I went in eventually, left it fully open, and held with a sort of little metal thingy which held the knob to the wall in this position, and went in to complete my work. The next thing that I hear, with my back to the door, it absolutely slams shut with an incredible force that I honestly have no idea how anyone or anything could shut it that hard. I admit that I was creeped out now, but when I went to open it, and to my surprise, the knob inside of it is just a round handle which doesn't turn in any way and is used to push from the inside of the door if it's not closed. Well, you can probably guess what was closed too, and unable to be opened from the inside without keys. The outer garage door. So I spent the next hour waiting for the agent to finish a showing and to come and rescue me with another set of keys. Now, I initially thought that I mustn't have latched the door properly or something. And I mean, even if my OCD about leaving every single window closed to avoid banging doors with air currents and all that, that didn't matter. It had to have been blown closed somehow. It seemed like the most rational explanation, even if the door was absolutely heavy for me to move initially. The thing is, though, is that when I became creeped out about the basement, I decided to get my then unemployed significant other on the FaceTime call, as I was suddenly feeling even less welcome and thus much less safe here. She clearly remembers me showing her how I properly latched the door, and even laughing at me and making some jokes about how I was scared of ghosts and all that. And to be quite honest, I still am not sure about how that door actually closed. But what I do know is that this is another instance of a home that just didn't sell, and I know for a fact that it still remains vacant, as I sometimes even pass that area still. This one might be chalked up to me still being much less experienced on the job and easier to scare and all that, but it is definitely the place where I felt less welcome than normal. I must say, though, that after having visited more than 300 homes now, only having 4 stories to tell is quite a nice statistic, really. I, however, now fear the living much more than those who are no more but are still with us, and those are not paranormal stories, just some that made me question people's sanity, really. But in any case, I hope you have enjoyed my different scares, and I look forward to not having any more stories to share with any of you during the rest of my career. This happened about 3 weeks ago, and I haven't stopped thinking about it since. So, I go on walks every evening at around 9, just in the forest near my home. It's super close and nothing weird ever really happens there. I always take the same route, which also goes along this bike path toward a bridge. So, I had my headphones in, just walking like usual, when I see 2 people on horses coming my way. Not weird by itself, I mean, there is a riding school nearby, but they looked at me kind of strange. Not like mean or anything, but just like they were trying to warn me almost. Hard to explain, but I ignored it in the end. A few minutes later, this boy on a bike passes me. Then I see him meet some guy further down the path, and he just suddenly turns around and bikes away. Again, I didn't really think anything of it. Maybe he was just doing laps or something. But then I get close enough to see the guy, and I swear that I've never seen something so weird in real life. He looked like he was around 30 or so, and he was wearing this full-on clown outfit. Not a full costume exactly, but super bright green and orange clothes, a wig, these big goofy glasses, and the weirdest part, he was wearing wooden clogs, actual clogs, so you could hear him from far away because of the sound on the pavement. I genuinely thought that people were pulling a prank on some random hikers or something like that, but the man didn't interact with me in any way. Plus, it was also getting pretty dark, so there was barely anyone in the forest now. He didn't look at me or say anything, just stared straight ahead like he was totally out of it. I think that he could have been on drugs, but I don't know for sure. I passed him and acted like it was normal, but I was honestly kind of scared that he'd turn around or do something. The only thing that made me feel okay, though, was hearing the clogs, because I could tell that he was still walking away. But when the clogs stopped a minute later or so, I turned around, and the weirdest thing is that he was gone, like completely gone, vanished almost. I don't know where he could have gone that quickly. I mean, there's trees and stuff, but it's not like there's a place to hide right there. I still walk the same route every night, but I've never seen him again, and I really don't know what to think about it. This happened in early summer, 3 years ago. It was a little after 10 p.m. when I drove home from work and saw police cars, fire trucks, and ambulances parked around the lot, their red and blue lights flashing, casting colors across the surrounding buildings. Around the yellow tape strung across the scene, neighbors had gathered like onlookers, pointing toward the apartment where I lived, and speaking to each other with worried expressions. As I tried to avoid the crowd and pulled into the parking lot in front of the apartment, I saw a police officer nearby, so I asked what had happened. "Hey, excuse me, sir, I live in that apartment. Did something happen?" The officer, wearing a serious expression, replied, "There was a call saying a child was jumping around and playing on the roof of that apartment." That's ridiculous, I thought. The apartment that I lived in was newly built. You could say that it had a bit of a Nordic style, though that might be putting it a little bit too nicely. The standout feature, though, was definitely the large red mansard roof, and I had chosen the place because I really liked its design. A mansard roof is one that changes slope partway down. They say the steep angle helps snow slide off easily, so you don't need to shovel it. It's supposedly much steeper than a regular residential roof. And there's just no way that a child could be jumping and playing on top of that roof, especially not after 10 p.m. Well, I parked and walked toward the apartment entrance, slipping past the stares of the bystanders, and just then, several police officers came clomping down the stairs and shouted to the firefighters, "We need a stretcher, bring the stretcher now." As I stood there in stunned silence, paramedics rushed up and down the stairs. Apparently, the resident who lived in the unit directly beneath the part of the roof where the child had been had collapsed inside of the room or something. After a short while, someone was carried out in a black body bag zipped up over their face and loaded onto a stretcher by the paramedics. At the same time, police officers and firefighters held up a large sheet from the apartment entrance to the ambulance to shield the scene from view. I assumed the person must have passed away or something. Later I found out that it was a woman in her 30s who had lived in the unit next to mine. After witnessing the whole thing up close, I finally returned to my apartment, but knowing that the person living next door had died, I really couldn't sleep that night. And the next morning I went to work feeling pretty heavy. I wonder what happened to that kid on the roof. There were no updates after that, so the unease lingered for about a week, I'd guess. One night though, at around 10 p.m. as usual, I came home from work, parked my car, and happened to glance toward my grandmother's house. One reason I had chosen this apartment, aside from liking the exterior, was that my grandmother, who lived alone, had a house close enough to see from my window. I figured that I could check on her from time to time. And in that moment, I couldn't believe my eyes. Against the pitch-black sky, with a full moon sharply outlining every edge, I saw a boy jumping up and down on the roof of my grandmother's house. I panicked and called the police, trying to explain what was happening. As I did, the memory of the incident from a week ago came rushing back, and that was when a terrible thought flooded my mind. My grandma. I ran straight to my grandmother's house right after the call and rang the doorbell, but there was no answer. The thought that he was coming for my grandma and that he was taking her swirled around in my head, and I was in a complete panic now. If I had to put it into words, it felt like my blood was boiling and surging through my whole body, as if I might explode from the inside out. With trembling hands, I fumbled for the spare key and rushed inside, only to find my grandmother collapsed in the living room. Everything that happened after that felt like a dream, and I just cannot really remember many of the details. but from what I was told later, she had already passed away before I had found her. But still, what on earth was that boy doing, jumping on the roof like that? Honestly, I'm convinced that that boy was death itself. And ever since then, I try not to look at the rooftop so that I never see him again. This happened when I was in the 5th grade. Now, because I live in Kyrgyzstan, the school system is not the same as America. I had first shift, and that means I had school from like 8 a.m. to like 1 p.m. I was the kid that was always heading back to my house after school, but I was always walking with at least 2 of my best friends, because we lived near each other. After we got to the point where we were about to head in different directions, we said goodbye to each other and began walking away from each other. It was autumn, so I was dressed in a school uniform with jacket and a hat. It was quite chilly. We had 7 entrances to the building. Mine was the 7th one. I lived in a pretty good neighborhood in the center of town, so when I started approaching the door to the 7th entrance, I noticed a man that was standing near the entrance. To clarify, he was actually on the porch. Now, I had a bit of a weird feeling when I looked at him, telling me not to enter the building with him, and he looked at me with his empty eyes, and I was a bit scared by that. So he turned his head in my direction, looked at me, and entered the building. My mother always told me to not enter the building with other people, so I stayed on the porch trying to hear if he took the elevator or something, so that I could eventually enter the building alone. As I heard the elevator go up, I entered the building, and thankfully nobody was there. I touched the elevator button, waiting, entered the elevator, and pressed on the 8th floor. As I was going up, that was when I heard fast footsteps on the staircase, because the elevator was near it. You could hear anyone going up those stairs, but it sounded like somebody was running, and that was when I began to panic, because genuinely, I didn't know what to do. I knew then, though, that he was about to approach me as the doors opened. I started banging, pressing on the doorbell. Unfortunately, my older brother was always slow at opening it, so I had to wait for a little bit. As I looked at the staircase, I saw the man running full speed, looking directly at me. He was really tall too, and he was like skipping 3 stairs at a time. I was terrified, so I started banging, and meanwhile he was looking at me as he was running. My brother finally opened the first door, but the story doesn't end here because I flew inside, locked the doors, and told my brother about this situation. Also, I need to mention that I know every neighbor in our 7th building, so I never saw that man before. He also was quite ugly and looked very unkempt. But my brother, who was 16 at the time, and 185 centimeters, was also a wrestler. He opened the door and approached the man, questioned him about who he was, and the man started getting aggressive. And also, he grabbed his phone and started acting like he was talking with someone. The man became very rude, aggressive. My brother was calm asking questions, but my brother said to him that he was scaring people who were living here. The man didn't seem to care though and started cursing. My brother in the end just closed the door fast and told me to be careful. I still live here though, and honestly I'm still pretty scared of entering this building after everything that happened. Strange occurrences have been a constant in my life for as long as I can really remember, affecting my whole family, in fact. I might understand some of the earlier events, but these days, when I think about it all, I'm just really stumped. Growing up in an abusive home with my family of 6, I witnessed my father's abuse towards my mum and siblings, though he never targeted me. My early memories are pretty vague though, likely because our brains tend to shield us from traumatic experiences at a young age, so a lot of it is sort of lost to me. but I'm going to tell you about some instances that I remember, also with the help of my siblings' memory to fill in the gaps a little bit. Now, we lived in an apartment complex that used to be some sort of a school or something. It had a cut-down statue of what we think was Jesus in the front, so maybe a religious school. Sharing a room with my sister, I always left the bedroom door open with the bathroom light on. This was because almost every night I would spot a shadow figure, often called the Top Hat Man, though my family nicknamed him Lincoln. He was tall and lanky, and he would always just sort of stand there, staring for what felt like forever before vanishing in a blink. He was also the culprit behind the chaos in the kitchen. Cabinets always flinging open, kitchenware scattered everywhere. Of course, my father always blamed us, and we would always end up getting in trouble. I don't have many memories of him, but he was always just sort of there, I guess. One night, after my father was incarcerated and my mother was out with her new boyfriend, we were all in the living room watching a movie at some point. I have a very vivid memory of running to my sister's and my shared room, screaming at some point. I always dismissed this memory, assuming that it had to do with something with my father's abuse towards my mother, but that wasn't it. Recently, I brought it up to my brother, and he told me what really happened. So apparently we were all sitting in the living room watching TV when suddenly all the drawers in the cabinets just sort of swung open, throwing everything everywhere. Then the TV remote, which was on top of the TV, levitated and flew across the room. And that was when we all ran to our shared bedroom and the door started rattling aggressively. That was all that he could remember, and that's all that I was told. I have encountered some unsettling events in my life, though, but one of the most truly chilling didn't occur until years later. We had just transitioned out of foster care and were able to live with my mum again. It was another apartment complex, but this time it was situated next to a graveyard, and from the moment that I moved into that place, I sensed an eerie feeling that I just couldn't quite place and often tried to dismiss it. At night, though, I would hear my name being called, a whisper just loud enough to terrify me. But there was one night that I will never forget. It began as a normal evening. I was on my phone, either talking to friends or watching YouTube or something, when I heard my name. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, and I had learned to ignore it at this stage, but eventually I drifted off to sleep. I woke up sometime later, with the distinct feeling of being sort of watched. Slowly I scanned my room, starting with the door. It was slightly ajar and the bathroom light was on. As my eyes adjusted, I saw a figure across the room. My heart leapt into my throat as I made out the form of a little boy sitting in my old recliner. He was looking at me too, but not in a menacing way. He was propped in the chair with one leg resting on the arm. His body was tilted back and his hands were fiddling with a thread on the chair. He was dressed in a brown velvet suit. Nice clothes, but they seemed really out of place in our time. He just stared at me. Half asleep, I thought it might have been my brother at first, not wanting to believe what I was seeing, I guess. So I called my brother's name and said, "What are you doing in my room? Get out." But there was no response. He just kept staring. Finally, though, after yelling at him, I grabbed my pillow and threw it at him. He didn't throw it back, though, didn't change his expression, and simply pushed it off of the chair onto the floor. And at that, I immediately got up and ran to turn the light on. And when I turned back, he was gone. I ran to my mother's room and I told her about what happened, and so I slept in her room for months after that. Today, too, I genuinely believe that something might be following me. You see, after being placed back into foster care, strange, subtle things started happening. It stopped when I moved in with my boyfriend, but now that we have our own place, it's happening again. Like a couple of days ago, I tripped walking into our open living room or game room or sort of dining area from the living room. There are 2 small steps between the areas, and I tripped before my foot even reached the first step. And look, I'm a bit clumsy, I'll admit, but I swear to you that I felt something grab my foot. I ended up face planting, and my torso hit the step hard enough to knock the wind out of me. My foot is also now bruised, even though I didn't hit that on anything. Since we moved in, small unsettling things have been happening over and over again. Objects seem to move on their own. The other day, my boyfriend saw a small round piece on a TV stand roll a short distance and then stop abruptly without falling. I often wake up in the middle of the night with a distinct feeling of being watched. My boyfriend thinks that it might be his late uncle, who his family believes is acting as a guardian angel, but I'm not so sure about that. These incidences mostly happen to me, or at least when I'm nearby, which makes me think that it is something else entirely, and perhaps something related to everything that I grew up with.